I'm here with Adam Wiggins, thrilled to discuss the future of pen and paper in a digital world. Adam is a perfect person to learn from, and he's a director of a research lab that works on digital tools of the future. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
For our listeners to understand from where you're coming from, among other interests, Adam co-founded Heroku, a platform for deploying and running apps acquired by Salesforce in 2010. At some point after successful exit, Adam relocated from San Francisco to Berlin. And I must admit, I read your essay about the decision taken by the comparisons you described between US and European startup communities. Adam, outside of his advising opportunities here in Europe for over 4 years, is a part of a research lab, Ink&Switch. And that's where we met, as we've both focused on innovative computer-mediated forms of teaching and working. And your vantage point, Adam, gives us a great opportunity to discuss what lies ahead in terms of interfaces and computer-supported creativity. And before we get there, though, describe, if you will, your research lab focus and expand the story that I drafted on how you got where you are today.
Yeah, happy to. So Ink&Switch is a independent research lab, and our theme or our area of focus is kind of what computer use will look like in 10 years, in particular creative or productive computer use. So by that I mean word processing, spreadsheets, Photoshop are kind of the traditional kinds of things you would think of, or maybe more broadly, thinking, creating productive tools. And that kind of standing in contrast to the what I would call consumptive uses of computers that have taken over a lot more of kind of, let's say, this tech world's focus in recent years: Facebook, Netflix, YouTube, social media, etc. And so we're kind of chartered with thinking about, what does that future look like, and how can we make it better for creators? And then in terms of how I got here, I'm a serial entrepreneur, but I guess you could say the theme across my career has always been that I love making tools that help other people make things. Just get a particular thrill out of that, I guess. Done everything from payment gateways to fabric retail, and then developer tools. Probably the most successful of all of these was a cloud deployment company called Heroku. And that was basically just a tool for taking a web app that you've written and getting it online with the push of a button. And that was quite successful, and actually that gave me a lot of both the sort of financial freedom, but also the ability to kind of leave the Bay Area and go work on something a little weird, a little fringy, not as connected to Silicon Valley, doesn't pay as well. But for me, at least, had some more intrinsic interest and potential more benefit to humanity over the long term.
And why Europe was the choice?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a process of elimination, which is I wanted to go someplace interesting after having spent most of my life in California and 7 years in San Francisco, and was really ready for a change of pace. I really wanted to be creatively refreshed, much as I loved the Bay Area and a lot of what was emerging in the startup world at that time. I also felt like it was hard to have new or original ideas because there's a kind of groupthink that naturally emerges when you get a bunch of the same kind of people together in the same place working on the same kinds of problems. But I still wanted to do something connected to the startup world, and there's really not that many cities that are great for that. It's kind of like San Francisco, New York, London, and Berlin then had kind of an up-and-coming scene. And of those four, Berlin seemed the most interesting. So I went there to do some short-term gigs and advising and kind of fell in love with the place, and still here 5 years later.
You describe yourself as a digital toolmaker, and I understand your drive toward creative tools for those that want to be creative. That's also the focus of your research lab. What's your routine for developing ideas?
Yeah, well, part of why I've thought a lot about sort of how people develop ideas and introspected on my own process as well is that's an area of study for our lab. We've done a lot of kind of user studies, user research around what does a creative process actually look like. So for myself, I've realized in this, I'm definitely what I would call a deep work type. So I kind of identify a problem or an opportunity that needs deep thinking. Usually that comes in the form of a suspicion or some weird nod in the brain, kind of feels like a pebble in the shoe, and feels like it needs attention. And I'll just set aside, usually in the morning, which is when I'm kind of most fresh and creative, anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, or longer, however long it takes to tackle the problem. And there's a process that involves lots of raw material, everything from web research and sketches and notes I've taken on my phone, and then bringing all that together in a place I can kind of see it all together, and then using that to kind of riff on the idea, extend it, ask questions. And that brings us to something we've been spending a lot of time thinking about, which is what we usually call externalized thinkers, which probably has some good overlap with visual thinkers. But it's just basically if you're the kind of person that tends to use a notebook to kind of write down your ideas or sketch out your ideas, or for myself, for example, when I'm in a meeting, I feel more productive when there's a whiteboard there where you can kind of extend the conversation into this visual space, write things down, scribble, and so on to supplement the group discussion. So that folks who are drawn to that, which is not everyone, but is a good chunk of creative people, we usually call externalized thinkers, and I'm definitely one of those. So I do these kind of deep work sessions where I use externalized thinking through pen and paper, through my iPad, through my computer, and so on, to kind of make a big mess with lots of inputs and use that to find patterns, get insights, and ultimately, hopefully, make a decision or develop my idea in a way that allows me to move forward with it.
Right. With what kind of software you currently support your process of ideation?
Yeah, so I've used all kinds of things over the years, everything from kind of Dropbox as like my main kind of archive, long-term personal corpus, many types of note-taking apps, more recently with the tablet and stylus form factor, sketching stuff. Currently, one of our research tracks that we've pursued in the lab over the last few years is sort of this thing where you have a freeform canvas where you can move these media cards around, kind of mix different media types and sketch at the same time. And actually, at the moment, we're trying to take that line of research, which we've written a few long manuscripts about, and actually spin that out into a commercial product. So with any luck in the coming months, the project we're currently trying to commercialize, which is called Muse, might be available in the App Store for the iPad. So I tend to use that a lot because we're trying to test out the viability of that as a real-world product.
I just wonder what kind of software category you think of when thinking of Muse, because from my observation, this creative mode of thinking, visual thinking, is very little supported by existing software categories. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a remarkable thing I've noted. Yeah, ideation, sometimes you call that early stage, right? When you think of most digital tools, like a word processor or a photo editor or a diagram tool, I would call those authoring tools. So you kind of already know what you need to say, and now you want to get it written down, or get it into a presentation or get it into some shareable format. But the part where you need to actually figure it out in the first place, that's a place that's never been, I think, super well supported by digital tools. And maybe it's just that computers are fundamentally kind of structured and rigid. They're good for databases and tables and things, but the creative process, at least mine, is just very messy and freeform and all over the place. And this is where analog tools, the pen and paper, the whiteboard, the printouts that you can kind of scatter around and reorder the pages, Post-its on a wall, that stuff I think better maps to the creative process. And I don't think it's infeasible that computers could do that. And in fact, that's part of what we're trying to pursue with Muse. But I think not many tools have tried to do that, right? You either have very kind of visual and freeform, relatively visual and freeform things like Illustrator or Figma or something like that, but they tend to be very focused on the visual side. Whereas I think realistically, most of your thinking, deep work kind of stuff tends to be lots and lots of text. And of course, you can do that in a text editor, a word processor, or something like your note-taking app. But then you also need the sketching and scribbling. So somehow bringing both of those things together, I think, is not something that's ever been a great fit for digital tools. But it's also part of the reason why at the lab we're excited about tablet form factors. We've spent a lot of time evaluating the different platforms there, including iPad and Chrome OS and the Microsoft Surface and so forth, because I think the different form factor and the different posture that you use, a tablet and stylus, maybe, it's kind of our working hypothesis, is that may be more suitable to that kind of freeform ideation. But fundamentally, computers tend to become from this more like rigid and structured kind of approach.
Yeah, I fully agree with you there.
The tools that we use today are kind of like descendants of those computer technologies that were created to support processes where you don't want to overstep boundaries. For each input, there's a certain output. What you're describing here, however, is kind of divergent thinking mode of operating, where you explore possibilities and then probably later arrive at a conclusion that can be processed using those more rigid process-oriented systems. You know, when we speak with people that make use of whiteboards, they tell us that, for example, in sales, the best thing that can happen during sales conversation is having a customer reaching out for a piece of paper or a whiteboard and start drawing with you, exchanging thoughts, because that illustrates engagement. And current multi-touch devices are good enough to support that, but yet they are not yet seen as devices to support divergent thinking. Rather, they are seen as devices for content consumption. Do you see it in a similar way?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, generally speaking, in a conversation or a sales meeting, someone going to their device is not seen as a good sign that things are going well. But then walking up to the whiteboard does indicate a kind of an opening up, we're going to think through a problem together, or we're going to think through something together, which is it's an interesting connection. And then, the divergent versus convergent thing is also, I like that phrasing or labeling the idea of divergent thinking being you're kind of just everything's open, you're trying to widen up. Sometimes I talk about like double diamond as kind of like that opening and then closing, but at some point you need to narrow down and select and so on. And you could say that perhaps the kind of the digital tools we have today tend towards being better for convergent thinking, and what we lack is the divergent thinking. That's a nut no one's really quite cracked yet.
But I also think that we are currently in a situation where creatives, when they want to go visual, are forced to use tools dedicated to professional designers. But in the real life, every message, every pitch is an invitation for expression, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've even struggled with using the word creative, creator, creative professional, like finding the right terminology, because I think it is easy when you hear creative to think, I don't know, a beret-wearing designer that's doing paint in some kind of mysterious process. But I think of it like all of those wider array of knowledge work or creative professional things, including budgeting, sales process, making a presentation, a software engineer, doing database schema or something. These are, in the broader sense of the word, creative activities, in the sense that they create. And they do depend on ideas, and they do depend on divergent thinking. And the best people at their jobs are people, or this kind of work tend to be people who can make those unusual leaps and have unusual insights. It's not a straight line from the problem to the best solution, maybe.
You know, when I hear what pioneers of visual communication have to say, let's say David Sibbett, he mentions often that visuals in business act as props on the stage for management to sell their visions. Also, the expression "I see" stands for understanding, right? So to me, it demands visual expression.
Yeah, I mean, many of the most powerful ideas I've encountered in philosophy and life, as well as in business, do have some kind of visual expression. I think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs as one example. There's plenty of examples of those in the business world. I don't know, Steve Jobs famously like boiling down the cluttered Apple product line when he came back to a sort of a two-dimensional grid that essentially gives you 4 products. And that kind of very simple breakdown can just be incredibly powerful. Of course, you can also lampoon that a little bit. I think the HBO Silicon Valley show had the goofy CEO guy that had his convergent triangles of whatever that was just like a nonsense visual expression, sort of visual diagram, sort of making fun of that trend. But it's sort of something that people are so aware of, because a truly great visualization can really help you, or often can really help both express and help you grasp an idea that words alone, for example, wouldn't be able to.
And I believe we all well rooted for that. To pull a quote from Aristotle, "Without an image, thinking is impossible." That kind of explains it, right? But I wonder, What you think about what creatives and their environments could tell us about digital environment for open-ended thinking? I saw a great article on your research lab page about physical workspaces that are stimulating for creatives, supporting tendencies for nesting things, availability of space, and using messy free form for expression that you mentioned that you use as well.
That's right. Yeah, we take a ton of inspiration from physical world, sort of crafting spaces, workspaces, fluid, free form, a little informal, a little personal, a little messy, which all of those things don't tend to be what we get in our digital tools. Personally, I love reading what I usually call maker biographies of people who create things, kind of the process of that heartbreak and challenge and struggle of how to make something, write a book, do science, invent something, an entrepreneur, that sort of thing. And the historic ones I find especially fun because often their tools are maybe quaint by our standards, but they're often quite interesting and beautiful. Famous examples is someone like Leonardo da Vinci with his notebooks, or Marie Curie's notebooks, who are still, still radioactive to this day. And in that category, especially for stuff that's new enough, where we have photographs, you go look at, for example, the Thomas Edison's invention workshop, or various sort of architects or artist studios. And I always get the feeling that they're kind of like a nest. They're personal. They have some selection of tools. That's exactly what they need for their craft. If it's an architect, maybe that's drafting tables and straight edges. Maybe it's an artist, maybe it's brushes. If it's someone more kind of word-oriented, maybe it's books. They're often a little cluttered. They're often a little messy. They seem like, yes, but a place you can try things. You can experiment. You can mess around basically while you're exploring an idea. And again, none of that. Maybe you get a little hint of that in how some people treat their, in a desktop operating system like a Mac, Windows, Linux. The way that people kind of scatter files all over their desktop screen could be a little bit of that feeling. But I love looking at those old school studios or what have you, and something about that. It's not necessarily being messy, but something about the nesting, the personal, the selection of tools, and the space to experiment. I think that's something we certainly have been taking inspiration from with Muse and our various previous incarnations of the ideation tools.
I'm sure you'll agree that current tools don't invite messiness to fuel that type of thinking.
Yeah. Well, which you can see as a feature. I do see as a feature that they provide structure and uniformity and normalization. I think that's great for certain things. I don't think I'd want a messy Trello board. The point of Trello is that it helps you get a little organized and structured. But if you're talking about that ideation divergent phase, that's where maybe that's an impediment rather than a benefit.
Absolutely. Structure is great, but later in the process, after you arrive at an idea. And you mentioned Leonardo. He famously suggested to look for inspiration in a splash of paint to start from. So when thinking about free flow of ideas, the way we work is that we put things on a canvas of a digital whiteboard to draw connections, similarly as you do with Muse. So I see an ocean of similarities here. And also, when thinking about inspirations coming from pre-digital age, I often think of Durer. He encouraged students to express ideas visually using strokes. Not text, but strokes. Wow. I wonder where those findings get us when thinking of computer interfaces of the future.
Yeah, well, obviously it's, since I've said it's part of our lab's job to think about that, something I've put a lot of thought into. Clearly mobile and touchscreens have set a new standard, a new expectation in terms of always on internet and great battery life and, screens you can interact with and just an integration to the world, right? That we take our phones with us and we pop them open for a photo or a note or something like that. And that kind of trend continues with the voice assistant things, and we'll see how that actually works out. But we definitely see this interleaving of digital and physical worlds. But my question there in thinking about the future UIs, okay, that's all great for, again, these common sort of more consumer uses like sending a message, calling yourself a ride share, social media, playing a podcast. But when it comes to creators, it's still all about the keyboard and mouse, or the keyboard and some kind of pointing device, a Wacom tablet or something. And someone good with these on a desktop computer is so fast, so precise, so capable. touchscreens and sort of mobile interfaces are just slow and clumsy by comparison. But then I go, well, is keyboard and mouse still what we'll be using, say, in a decade? And I think that's questionable because if nothing else, you've got a generation of people that grew up on touchscreens and are not really comfortable with keyboard and mouse.
Do you think that we're still in a situation that we're confined to the interfaces we started with? We began with character-based consoles of the computer terminals, as they were called back then. But gradually restrictions for other types of input were removed, and yet we still seem to stack with paradigms of legacy user interfaces.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't necessarily say stuck with. It's that they're really, really good, right? They stood this test of time, and people are powerful with them, and software has been built assuming them and that sort of thing. And I think we're still collectively as an industry trying to grasp how we can use these new capabilities or the new expectations that younger generations will have. And I think, there's interesting experiments with, Google Jamboard and Microsoft Surface Hub with sort of big touchscreens that go on the wall that you can touch with several people together. And certainly the human-computer interaction community that our lab is a little bit a part of has done a lot on that. But we kind of haven't quite cracked it. We haven't really found the thing that is truly going to unlock some new level of productivity that you don't have at a desktop computer with keyboard and mouse. I think the thing I would be excited about, just kind of speculatively, is something that does draw from those maker studios we talked about before, those nests, those workspaces, where it's something that uses some of this kind of touchscreen, maybe even voice control capability, but it's more of a room-sized workspace. And something where you've got maybe multiple screens, which include small ones you carry or bigger ones that are a drafting table form factor or something on the wall. Certainly being willing to embrace multi-touch styluses, to use two hands at once, right? Like that's something we've written about a lot, which is, phone apps tend to be designed for that one-handed use, just do it with your thumb. But in this kind of workspace, we've got 10 fingers, let's use them all, right? And that if we cut free a little bit, both try to grasp the new kind of capabilities that we have from the hardware and the operating systems, but also kind of try to cut free of that legacy of a small screen on the go, just do it with one hand. You bring in the fingers, the voice, the stylus. Maybe in some Hollywood version of this is like, Tony Stark in his Iron Man lab talking to Jarvis and touching screen. That's all obviously very Hollywood, but I think I see some version of that. And if you tie it in with the remote work trend a little bit, what we have with video chat, group chat, shared documents, real-time collaboration, you put that together with some kind of room-sized workspace that uses these new interfaces, but also cuts free of the old mobile assumptions and gives you more powerful gesture libraries. That starts to become a picture of, at least that I can get excited about for where computers for creation might be in 10 years.
Do you think we would be intimidated by those capabilities, using gestures and visual techniques? The way I see it is that kindergarten kids in schools, they can explain everything with a simple drawing. But the process of communicating visually is kind of unlearned during later stages of education, in which use of words is more emphasized than use of images.
Yeah, that's interesting. We definitely, when you look at the academic tradition, which includes everything from, how you write a master's thesis or, papers you consume in the scientific world and all the homework we do kind of in the earlier stages of kind of school life. They tend to be very, very word-oriented. And words and symbolic representation more generally, that includes mathematics, for example, is incredibly powerful and really good. I probably agree with you that maybe there's an overemphasis on that. And it depends on the idea being expressed, and it depends on the person that's expressing it or trying to express it to. Certainly trying to maybe recapture some of that childhood reach for the natural visual expression is something I could really get behind.
So on one hand, we have limitations of current UI that kind of draw from the past, and we kind of start to allow for free flow of thinking using interactive whiteboards or solutions like the one you're working on currently. On the other hand, we have users of those solutions that might not be fully ready to appreciate those solutions when they arrive because of visual skills being left behind in person's education. This reminds me of a situation back again with Durer, the painter and the theorist of German Renaissance. He was known for working around constraints of the technology of his time, and the printing press was kind of brand new his days. So he worked to add graphical doodles and freehand movements to the more rigid printed materials. Those are now understood by scholars as the proof of his creativity and desire for free expression of his ideas. Don't you think we're both in similar situation with digital technologies of our times?
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison. Obviously, the printing press and typeset, these literal rigid rows that you would sort of plug pre stamped out letters made of metal into is the definition of being very structured and takes you away from that free-form doodling. And notably, what came before, I love these texts that were kind of handmade from the 13th, 14th century, where you have the handwritten text, but then there's always what they call the illumination, which is essentially they're just doodles in the margin, but they're gorgeously beautiful. They illustrate sometimes either something to do with the text, or they just illustrate something about the time. And again, something like we lose some of that freeformness and some of that visualness when we do go to the structure of the printing press. And obviously the benefits, I think, outweigh the losses that we could mass produce this stuff. But yeah, it'd be great to see if we can find the technologies to bring that back a little bit.
I'm surely on your side hoping for that. Fast forward 20 years. Let me know what you think of the division of labor between humans and machines as we see steady progress in AI technologies. And I wonder, what do you think when thinking about computer technologies, how this progress in AI affects our choices when preparing for the future?
Yeah, well, you can call me probably a little bit more skeptical of the impact of AI maybe in the near term at the very least. Although I think it's definitely interesting to think about. I mean, one observation is that machines are often better at what we might call brain work than physical work. Mm-hmm. So, like, I don't know, autocorrection or detecting credit card fraud, or even something like self-checkout in a grocery store. Those work a lot better than actually sort of grasping and manipulating the physical object. And I certainly hope that, or I think it will be good in the long term, even though it hurts some folks job-wise in the short term, that more and more machines will do those, let's call them rote kind of thinking jobs. But yeah, when it comes to creative activities, I'm very skeptical about machines matching or even matching humans anytime soon, maybe ever, and it probably reflects at least a somewhat irrational faith in the uniqueness of the human spirit, or just something I want to believe rather than something I have a good rational basis for. But I do feel like computers do well with well-defined inputs and outputs and repeating patterns of the past. But creativity is fundamentally about inspiration, about walking off the beaten path, about surprising insights. It doesn't have clean inputs. It doesn't have clean outputs. And maybe also it's just that an inspired creation is something that wakes something in another human. And for the foreseeable future, it's hard to imagine that will be done by something other than other humans. But of course, machines have a huge role. There's the tools, the digital equivalent of pen and paper. But they'll also be, in a way, I think, collaborators for us, just like a grammar checker or an auto-summarization algorithm helps out an author. And you see that in the design world, the architecture world, with kind of algorithmic design. It doesn't seem to reduce the role of the human, but it does change it maybe a little bit. And you can talk about having like a collaboration between the unique capabilities of computers, particularly as they get able to do more higher level thinking tasks, we might call it, and the human, which can guide them to the things, can guide the computer to the things that matter for humans and bring that kind of weird spark, that fundamental different creativity thing that is, again, I think unique to humans.
Supporting creativity makes us able to stay human in the future. And even what we think of as creative outputs might be considered as a glitch of logic from a perspective of AI. It's still, on the other hand, a very valuable asset that we have.
Yeah, well, again, I feel it. I don't know if that's intellectually defensible, but for sure. I mean, maybe it's partially at least that just I love both the creative process for myself, but also, again, got a whole lab that's a huge track of research is dedicated to understanding and introspecting that, seeing it at work in people, and it does really feel like there's something special there to me. Not say it's something that can't be replicated by machines, but I think it would just be a different thing if it is done by a machine, because they work in fundamentally different ways, and therefore, that's a reason to be positive about a future where there is a role for what machines can bring to the table, like generative or algorithmic design, and a role for the unique things humans do, perhaps with less of the rote work, and then maybe together we can create something better than either of us could individually.
Absolutely. Although I still fear we might arrive in an entirely deterministic world where no splash of paint is possible to open new possibilities. Adam, thank you for being with us today and sharing your perspective.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
That's all.